Okay, so like today we are diving into this story that kind of feels like classic David and Goliath, you know? Like a single law student is taking on like this academic giant Cambridge University.
Yeah.
Buckle up though, because like it gets pretty interesting.
It does. It really does.
Yeah.
It really makes you think about the challenges of balancing academic rigor with like individual learning differences, you know, especially when you're dealing with like these high stakes degrees.
Exactly. And we were talking about Jacob Meager.
Yeah.
He is suing Cambridge after he failed his PhD oral exam, like the infamous viva voce.
Right.
So his argument is that Cambridge's assessment methods were discriminatory.
Right.
And this cost him a really prestigious barrister position,
Oh, wow.
which really significantly impacted his potential earnings. What are your initial thoughts on his claim?
Well, you know, it's a complex situation.
Yeah.
Meagher contends that like the requirement of a 100,000-word thesis put him at a disadvantage. He argues that producing this kind of extensive written work is a challenge for him, and it raises important questions about how universities evaluate students and whether a one-size-fits-all approach is always appropriate.
So I'm wondering, are there any like studies or data that show how these kinds of lengthy written exams might disproportionately affect certain students?
There's definitely been research into the impact of different assessment methods on students with diverse learning styles.
Okay.
Some studies suggest that traditional written exams can be particularly challenging for students who process information differently or who may have difficulty with like written expression, even if they have a deep understanding of the subject matter.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like Meager was trying to like work within the system though.
Right.
Like he requested adjustments for the oral exam based on recommendations from Cambridge's own Disability Resource Center.
That's right.
Okay.
The recommendations included things like the examiners using active voice in their questions, allowing for pauses during the exam, and asking more focused questions instead of broader, more open-ended ones.
From an outside perspective, it seems reasonable that those accommodations could have been implemented without compromising the exam's integrity.
It does raise questions about what constitutes reasonable adjustments within the context of a PhD program.
Right.
While universities have a responsibility to provide support for students with disabilities, they also need to maintain the academic standards of their degrees.
Right. I'm curious about Cambridge's response to all of this. So what happened after Meager requested these accommodations?
Initially, the university indicated that Meagher could revise and resubmit his thesis.
Okay.
However, a university committee later reversed that decision, denying him the opportunity to resubmit.
That seems like a pretty significant shift in their stance.
It is.
Do you think that could be grounds for a breach of contract claim, given that they initially agreed to let him resubmit?
Potentially a breach of contract claim would hinge on whether there was a clear, legally binding agreement between Meagher and the university regarding the resubmission process. If the university had established procedures for thesis revisions and then deviated from those procedures without justification, that could strengthen his claim.
Okay, and what about Meagher's assertion that the university breached its duty of care? What exactly does that entail in this context?
Duty of care in this context refers to the responsibility that educational institutions have to provide a safe and supportive learning environment for their students. This includes taking reasonable steps to accommodate students' disabilities and to ensure that their policies and procedures don't create undue hardship or disadvantage.
So if the university knew about Meagher's difficulties and the recommendations from their own Disability Resource Center, but didn't effectively implement those recommendations, could that be seen as a breach of their duty of care?
That's certainly a line of argument that Meagher's legal team could pursue. They would need to demonstrate that the university's actions, or lack thereof, directly contributed to harm or detriment to Meagher's well-being or academic progress.
It's pretty clear that Meagher feels significantly let down by Cambridge, especially given that he was following the procedures outlined by the Disability Resource Center.
Right.
Before we dive into the potential legal outcomes of this case, I think it'd be helpful to understand the viva voce process a little better. For those who aren't familiar with the nuances of PhD programs, can you explain why this oral exam is such a big deal?
The viva voce, also known as the oral defense, is a crucial part of the PhD process in many universities. It's essentially an in-depth examination where the candidate has to defend their research and thesis in front of a panel of experts.
I imagine it can be quite nerve-wracking, especially after years of research and writing. What are the examiners typically looking for during a viva voce?
The examiners are assessing a range of factors, including the candidate's depth of understanding of their research topic, their ability to articulate their arguments clearly and persuasively, and their ability to respond to challenging questions and critiques of their work.
Yeah, it sounds like a pretty intense experience, to say the least.
It can be.
And as we've been discussing, this particular format might present like added challenges for students with certain learning differences or disabilities.
That's an important point to consider. While the viva voce has been like a long-standing tradition in academia, there's growing recognition that it might not be the most equitable or effective assessment method for all students.
I'm curious about the history of this type of exam. So how did the viva voce become like such a central part of the PhD process?
The origins of the viva voce can actually be traced back to medieval European universities.
Wow, that far back. I had no idea.
Yeah, during that period, knowledge was often transmitted orally.
Right.
The viva voce served as a public demonstration of a student's mastery of a particular subject. Think of it as like a scholarly equivalent of a knight proving their prowess in a tournament.
So it was like a way of defending one's intellectual territory.
Precisely. And over the centuries, while the format has evolved, the viva voce has retained its core function as a high-stakes oral examination. As the PhD emerged as the gold standard for research degrees, the viva took on even greater significance.
I can see how in the context of a PhD, the viva would be seen as a test of a candidate's ability to not only conduct original research, but also to articulate their findings and defend their work in a rigorous academic setting.
Exactly. But as with any long-standing tradition, it's worth examining whether the viva voce in its current form is truly serving its purpose in the best possible way.
Especially considering the potential for bias and the fact that it might not accurately reflect the abilities of all students.
Right. On the one hand, the viva can be a valuable tool for assessing a candidate's depth of understanding and their ability to think critically and engage in a scholarly dialogue.
I can see how that direct interaction between the examiners and the candidate could allow for a level of nuanced discussion that might not be possible in a purely written format.
Exactly. However, the inherent pressure of an oral exam combined with the possibility of unconscious bias on the part of examiners could create an uneven playing field.
It seems like the reliance on verbal fluency in the viva might not always be an accurate reflection of the depth or originality of a candidate's research.
That's a valid concern. Some scholars have argued that the viva in its current form might inadvertently favor students who are more comfortable with public speaking or who are skilled at thinking on their feet, even if their research isn't as strong as someone who might excel in written communication.
So, given these potential downsides, what are some of the arguments for and against retaining the viva voce as part of the PhD assessment process?
Well, there are those who believe that the viva voce, while imperfect, is still a valuable tradition that should be preserved, perhaps with some modifications to address these concerns about bias and accessibility.
Like the types of adjustments that Meager was requesting.
Exactly, providing clear guidelines to examiners about accommodating diverse learning styles, allowing for alternative formats for presenting research findings, and ensuring that assessment criteria are clearly articulated and fairly applied could be ways to make the viva voce more inclusive.
Are there those who believe that the viva voce should be abandoned altogether?
Yes, some academics argue that we need to move beyond the viva and embrace more innovative and equitable forms of PhD assessment.
What would those alternative forms of assessment look like?
There are many possibilities. Some have suggested incorporating a wider range of assessment methods, such as portfolios of work, public presentations, or even peer-reviewed contributions to scholarly journals.
Those options do seem like they would allow students to showcase their knowledge and skills in ways that might be more aligned with their strengths and learning style.
Right. The key is to ensure that any assessment method, whether traditional or innovative, is designed to be fair, transparent, and truly reflective of a candidate's scholarly abilities.
So circling back to Meagher's case, let's delve into the legal arguments he's putting forward. He's alleging discrimination under the Equality Act 2010. Can you give us a little more context on this act and how it applies to his situation?
The Equality Act 2010 is a comprehensive piece of legislation in the UK that prohibits discrimination on the basis of protected characteristics, including disability to succeed in his claim. Meager would need to prove that Cambridge's actions put him at a substantial disadvantage because of his disability.
So it's not just enough to show that he has a disability and that he failed the exam he has to demonstrate a direct link between his disability and the university's actions.
Exactly. He needs to show that the university failed to make reasonable adjustments for his disability, and that this failure directly contributed to his exam outcome.
That's where those recommendations from the Disability Resource Center become so crucial, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The fact that Cambridge had internal recommendations for adjustments, but seemingly didn't implement them effectively, could significantly strengthen Meagher's case. His argument is that had those adjustments been properly implemented, he would have been able to demonstrate his knowledge and abilities more effectively.
However, I imagine Cambridge will likely argue that they did make reasonable adjustments, and that his exam performance was due to factors unrelated to his disability.
That's a likely defense strategy. They might claim that Meagher's thesis didn't meet the required academic standards regardless of his disability, or that his performance in the viva voce itself was simply not up to par.
But if they initially agreed to let him revise and resubmit his thesis, wouldn't that undermine their argument that his work wasn't up to standard?
That's the interesting part. Their initial decision, followed by the sudden reversal, does raise questions about their internal processes and whether they consistently applied their own standards.
It does make you wonder if they changed their approach after perhaps realizing the potential implications of Meagher's disability claim.
It's certainly a possibility. Meagher's legal team will likely highlight this change in decision as evidence that the university wasn't acting in good faith, or that they were potentially trying to cover their tracks.
What about his other claims? The breach of contract and duty of care. How strong are those arguments?
The breach of contract claim hinges on demonstrating that Cambridge didn't uphold their end of the agreement they had with Meagher as a student. This could involve showing that they deviated from their own established procedures, or that they acted inconsistently or unfairly in his case.
And the duty of care claim essentially argues that the university had a responsibility to ensure his well-being and academic progress, and that they failed to do so.
Precisely to succeed in this claim, Meagher would need to prove that the university's actions or inaction directly resulted in harm or detriment to him.
It seems like this case raises some fundamental questions about the power dynamics between students and large institutions like Cambridge students. Especially those pursuing advanced degrees like a PhD are often in a vulnerable position, reliant on the university to act fairly and in accordance with their own policies.
That's an important observation. This case highlights the potential for imbalances of power within academic institutions and the need for greater transparency and accountability in their decision-making processes.
So given the complexities of this case, what are Meagher's chances of actually winning this legal battle?
It's difficult to say definitively. Disability discrimination cases can be very nuanced, and the outcome will ultimately depend on the strength of the evidence presented and the legal arguments made by both sides.
Regardless of the legal outcome, it seems like this case has the potential to have a significant impact on how universities approach disability accommodations and assessment methods. It also shines a light on the broader discussion about inclusivity and accessibility in higher education.
Absolutely. This case forces us to confront some uncomfortable truths about the ways in which traditional academic structures and practices might be creating barriers for certain students, particularly those with disabilities or diverse learning styles.
I think a lot of people can relate to that feeling of not quite fitting into the mold or struggling to meet expectations that might not be designed with their particular needs or learning differences in mind.
You're right. This case is a reminder that success can look very different for different people, and that our systems of education should be designed to recognize and value a wider range of talents and abilities.
Before we wrap up our deep dive into this fascinating case, I'd like to take a step back and consider the bigger picture here. What does this case say about the state of higher education today, especially when it comes to supporting students with disabilities?
That's a crucial question, and one that deserves careful consideration while there has been progress in terms of legal protections and awareness of disability rights. Meagher's case suggests that there's still work to be done.
It seems like many universities are still grappling with how to balance academic rigor with the need for greater inclusivity and flexibility.
You're right, there's often a tension between upholding traditional standards of excellence and ensuring that those standards aren't inadvertently creating barriers for some students.
And this case brings up the question of whether standardized testing in general is truly the best way to evaluate someone's knowledge and abilities.
That's a broader issue that extends far beyond the realm of higher education standardized tests. while efficient, can sometimes fail to capture the nuances of individual learning styles and can perpetuate existing inequalities.
It's like trying to fit everyone into the same box, regardless of their unique shape or size.
Exactly. And in doing so, we risk overlooking or undervaluing some brilliant minds that might simply express themselves or process information in ways that don't conform to those narrow parameters.
It sounds like we need to rethink our approach to assessment, not just in academia, but in many areas of life.
I think you're right. We need to move beyond the idea that there's only one right way to learn or to demonstrate mastery of a subject. We need to create systems that are more flexible, more individualized, and more responsive to the diverse range of human talents and abilities.
So as we wrap up, I'm curious to hear your thoughts on this. If universities were to completely reimagine PhD assessments, what would be the ideal way to evaluate a candidate's knowledge, skills, and contributions to their field?
That's a fantastic question, and one that I think deserves further exploration. Imagine a world where PhD candidates had a range of options to showcase their research and expertise, rather than being limited to a single format.
What kind of options are you envisioning?
Instead of just a thesis and a viva, they could have the opportunity to create a portfolio of work, give public presentations, contribute to peer-reviewed journals, or even develop real-world applications of their research.
Those options sound a lot more engaging and relevant to the actual work that researchers do in the real world.
Precisely. And it would allow students to play to their strengths and demonstrate their knowledge in ways that are most meaningful to them.
It would also challenge the traditional power dynamics in academia, giving students more agency and control over their own assessment.
That's an important point. Rethinking assessment isn't just about finding new methods, it's about shifting the power structures and creating a more collaborative and empowering learning environment.
I think this whole conversation has been incredibly thought-provoking. Meagher's case, while focused on a specific situation, raises so many broader questions about equity, accessibility, and the purpose of education itself.
I agree. It's a case that forces us to confront some fundamental assumptions about how we learn, how we assess knowledge, and how we create truly inclusive learning environments.
It really does make you think about how we define success and measure it.
Right.
So if Meagher's case is successful, do you think it could lead to more systemic changes in how universities approach disability accommodations and assessment more broadly?
It's certainly possible. Legal precedents often have a ripple effect, prompting institutions to reevaluate their policies and practices to avoid potential litigation. So a win for Meagher could encourage universities to proactively review their assessment methods and consider more flexible options.
It's interesting to think about how one person's decision to challenge the way things are can lead to wider changes that benefit so many people.
Yeah, it speaks to the power of advocacy and the importance of holding institutions accountable for creating equitable and inclusive environments. Sometimes it takes a courageous individual to bring these issues to the forefront and force a conversation to happen.
Yeah, and those conversations can be incredibly powerful for change. This whole case has got me thinking about my own experiences with standardized tests.
Yeah.
I always felt like they were more about jumping through hoops rather than actually showcasing what I knew or how I thought.
I think a lot of people can relate to that. Feeling the pressure to conform to a very narrow definition of success can be quite stifling, and it can discourage students from taking intellectual risks or exploring unconventional paths.
It really makes you wonder how many brilliant minds might have been overlooked or discouraged simply because they didn't excel in those particular testing environments.
That's a sobering thought. It highlights the need for a more holistic and personalized approach to education, one that values individual strengths and recognizes that there are many different ways to learn, process information, and demonstrate understanding.
So as we kind of wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave our listeners with a final thought-provoking question to ponder. If we were to truly reimagine PhD assessments moving away from these traditional models, what would be the ideal way to evaluate a candidate's contributions to their field?
That's a fantastic question to consider. Perhaps the ideal assessment would be a multifaceted approach that incorporates a variety of methods, allowing students to demonstrate their knowledge and skills in ways that best showcase their strength.
What might that look like in practice?
Imagine a system where students could choose to present their research through a traditional written thesis, a series of published articles, a portfolio of creative works, a public presentation, or even a real-world application of their research. The emphasis would be on demonstrating a deep understanding of the subject matter and the ability to contribute meaningfully to the field.
It seems like that kind of flexibility would not only be more inclusive, but also more aligned with the actual work that researchers do in their respective fields.
Exactly. It would encourage students to think more broadly about how their research connects to the wider world and how it can be applied to solve real-world problems, and it would allow them to present their findings in ways that are both rigorous and engaging, making their work accessible to a wider audience.
Well, this has been an incredibly insightful conversation. Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into the complexities of Jacob Meager's case against Cambridge and what it reveals about the broader challenges facing higher education.
It's been a pleasure to explore these important issues with you. I hope this discussion encourages listeners to think critically about the systems we have in place and to advocate for more inclusive and equitable approaches to education.
We'll be back next time with another fascinating topic. Until then, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep pushing for a better future for all.